1941, December 7th. The Pacific War was not an event that began solely on a calm Sunday morning. It was the brutal culmination of decades of escalating imperial ambition. It represented geopolitical maneuvering and a fundamental clash over Asian dominance. As early as the late 19th century, Japan and the United States entered the great game of Asian politics. Japan's aggressive expansionism began with the engineered conquest of Manchuria in 1931, as aggression escalated to the full-scale invasion of China in 1937 following the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This directly challenged the United States' open-door policy and Western colonial interests. The interminable quagmire in China frustrated the Japanese military. A lack of manpower for occupation fueled the belief that total war was the only solution. Japan's strategic desperation was rooted in acute resource scarcity. Its military machine required vast quantities of rubber, tin, and most critically, oil. These resources were found primarily in the colonies of Southeast Asia. The American-held Philippine Islands lay like a dagger across Japan's strategic sea lines of communication. Securing its resource base thus necessitated a confrontation with the United States. Following Japan's move into northern Indochina in September 1940, the United States retaliated. The Americans responded with increasing economic pressure, first embargoing all scrap metal. By the summer of 1941, the United States cut off fuel oil sales entirely. Japan's economic situation instantly became critical. Its fuel shortage made war for resources almost inevitable. Militant elements within Japan solidified their control. They were already chafing under the perceived inferiority imposed by the Washington and London naval treaties. They viewed the American embargo as an act of war. The formation of the Axis powers through the Tripartite Pact in the fall of 1940 signaled a clear alignment against the Western powers. This was true despite the pact's theoretical defensive nature. The United States was not blind to the danger. On the night of December 6, 1941, Commander Alvin D. Kramer of the Office of Naval Intelligence had a crucial mission. He was tasked with hand-delivering decrypted magic intercepts. He completed this task with his wife driving him through Washington, D.C. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the 15-page Japanese diplomatic cable that evening. He famously exclaimed, "This means war." American intelligence had provided timely warnings. However, these warnings were not fully understood or acted upon. This was due to the sheer volume of information and the novelty of the situation. The overriding priority of the Europe First policy also contributed to the confusion. Admiral Harold R. Stark issued a war warning to Pacific forces on November 26, yet critical naval assets were dispersed. This thinned the United States' presence at Pearl Harbor. The decision for war was agonizingly made by Emperor Hirohito on December 2nd. The following evening, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo swung his first mobile striking force south toward Hawaii. This force comprised 6 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers. On December 7th, Japanese invasion convoys broke into 4 groups for landings in Siam and Malaysia. Simultaneously, the attack on Pearl Harbor commenced. The USS Arizona's Navy Band No. 22 was ready to play for the flag raising. Instead, they ran for their battle stations. On the USS West Virginia, Stanley Bukowski mistook the approaching Japanese aircraft for a drill. He even joked about a torpedo run. This illusion was instantly shattered by the roar of engines and a hellacious explosion. Hundreds of naval aircraft, including the superior Japanese Zero fighter, descended upon Battleship Row. They sank or damaged all 8 battleships present. The attack caused over 3,200 casualties. At Hickam Field, planes were blown up on the ground. Simultaneously, the lightning war struck across the Pacific. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's Air Force was decimated before it could take off. This occurred despite his forces being considered grossly inadequate and placed on 3-day readiness. Japanese aircraft waited for daylight to strike. They caught American airfields unprepared. They eliminated more than half of MacArthur's air power. This crippled American offensive capabilities from the outset. The initial string of Japanese victories continued until the Philippines fell. Their navy and army literally ran wild. MacArthur's forces were ill-equipped with antiquated weapons. They were forced to withdraw into Bataan. Inadequate supplies there led to prolonged suffering. The defense of Corregidor, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, continued until May 6, 1942. However, the surrender of Bataan on April 9, 1942, marked a significant loss of American and Filipino forces. It initiated the brutal Bataan Death March. Approximately 72,000 prisoners were forced to march to San Fernando train station. Estimates suggest 650 Americans and 16,500 Filipinos died during this forced march. The deaths were due to malnutrition, sickness, and extreme brutality. Guards shot, bayoneted, or beheaded prisoners. Ensign Ann Bernatatas, a Navy Nurse Corps officer who served in the Philippines, detailed the challenging conditions. These included makeshift hospitals with limited facilities. The treatment of these prisoners established the brutal, war without quarter nature of the Pacific conflict. This horror hardened American resolve. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, had acknowledged the long-term disadvantage of war with the United States. He stated he had absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years. The Pearl Harbor raid was a tactical success, yet it was a strategic blunder. It failed to cripple the United States fleet's repair facilities and fuel depots. Most importantly, it irrevocably drew the United States into World War II. The attack ended isolationist sentiment. It fully mobilized the nation's overwhelming industrial power. Japan was undefeated but not victorious. This set the stage for a brutal war of attrition it could not win. The early stages of the Pacific War were a nightmare of Allied disorganization and devastating losses. It was a brutal echo of the surprise attack that had plunged America into the conflict. Japan's initial victories were swift and complete. Singapore fell, the Dutch East Indies were conquered, and the Philippines were subdued. The Allied medical situation was dire. It was characterized by makeshift hospitals on open concrete slabs, surgical gowns dated back to 1917. Sterilization often relied on crude methods. These included pressure cookers and Lysol. Dr. Alfred A. Weinstein and Dr. Claude Fraley worked frantically. They scrounged for vital supplies like lemon powder from Mariveles. They performed numerous amputations due to gas gangrene. The relentless Japanese advance, coupled with the systemic failure of Allied preparedness, created an atmosphere of chaos and despair. Yet, amid the gloom, a spark of defiance was lit. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-29 bombers. They launched from the deck of the USS Hornet in a daring strike against the Japanese mainland. The Doolittle raid caused little physical damage. Its psychological impact, however, was monumental. It shattered the illusion of Japanese invincibility. It forced the military leadership in Tokyo to divert critical resources for homeland defense. For the American public, it was a profound morale booster. It was a desperately needed sign that the war could be taken to the enemy. This psychological victory had a direct strategic consequence. It humiliated the Japanese military leadership. It evaporated any lingering resistance to Admiral Yamamoto's plan, Operation MI. This operation was designed to seize Midway Atoll. The raid set the stage for the crucial turning point of the Pacific War. The U.S. advantage lay not in firepower, but in silent ingenuity. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked tirelessly. The SA's codebreakers occupied a cramped, air-conditioned basement. They raced against time to make sense of the intercepted Japanese naval signals. They knew a major operation was coming, codenamed AF. However, the location remained ambiguous. Rochefort's team then executed a brilliant piece of deceptive intelligence. NA instructed Midway to transmit a plain text message reporting a critical shortage of fresh water due to damage. Within days, the codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message confirming that AF is short of water. The target was confirmed, Midway Atoll. Then Devon's intelligence breakthrough allowed Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to orchestrate a decisive ambush. It was the single most critical factor in the coming campaign. The shift to carrier-centric naval warfare defined the critical turning points of mid-1942. Before the showdown at Midway, the Japanese attempted Operation MO. This was an advance on Port Moresby in New Guinea. It aimed at severing the crucial supply lines to Australia. This operation led to the Battle of the Coral Sea in the first week of May 1942. It was a revolutionary engagement fought entirely by aircraft. Neither side's ships ever saw the other during the battle. Though the Allies lost the carrier USS Lexington, the battle halted the Japanese southern advance. More critically, the Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk. The fleet carrier Shokaku was also severely damaged, compromising its air wing. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, the Japanese commander in Rabaul, was forced to turn back the Port Moresby invasion force. This engagement severely depleted Japan's pool of experienced carrier crews and pilots. It was a loss that would prove irreplaceable just weeks later. Japanese overconfidence and strategic overextension set the stage for their own destruction. This overconfidence was fueled by their string of early victories. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his misgivings about a protracted war, believed one thing. He thought a decisive, annihilating strike against the remaining US fleet near Midway was necessary. His goal was to force a negotiated peace. Nimitz, armed with Rochefort's intelligence, positioned his forces for an ambush. The Sarakiria forces were vastly outnumbered by the Japanese. They included the hastily repaired USS Yorktown. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the decisive moment arrived. Admiral Nagumo's 4 large aircraft carriers were preparing to launch their second strike against Midway. These carriers were the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. They presented the worst possible moment for the Japanese. Coordinated American air attacks screamed in from 2 different axes, and the American torpedo bombers flew in obsolete TBD Devastator aircraft. These planes were described as obsolescent death traps. They were massacred by Japanese Zero fighters. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, recounted the harrowing experience. He noted that Zeros attacked in full strength, yet the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons drew the Japanese combat air patrols out of position. This action effectively cleared the way for the American dive bombers. In a concentrated, devastating period, the dive bombers descended. They came from the Enterprise and Yorktown task forces. They caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable point. Within minutes, the Kaga, Akaga, and Soryu were crippled. They burned from end to end, racked by secondary and tertiary explosions. These explosions were caused by bombs, torpedoes, and aviation gasoline. The Japanese damage control systems were inferior to those on US ships. The loss of veteran deck crews meant the intense fires could not be contained. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk later that same day. The Battle of Midway decisively crippled Japan's offensive naval power. It irrevocably shifted the strategic initiative to the Allies. Admiral Yamamoto witnessed the destruction of the core of his carrier fleet. He made the agonizing decision to abandon the invasion and retreat, and hundreds of 4 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots was a strategic defeat. Japan's naval aviation program would never fully recover from this blow. The battle validated the dominance of carrier-based air power. It marked the end of Japan's ability to run wild across the Pacific. It signaled the beginning of the long, grinding Allied offensive. The veteran carrier USS Yorktown, though damaged in the air attacks, suffered another fate. Akin was tragically sunk 2 days later by the Japanese submarine I-168. But by then, the strategic outcome was already sealed. The initiative now belonged firmly to the United States. The victory at Midway had secured the initiative for the Allies. It did not, however, win the war outright. The shift from the defensive to the offensive plunged American forces into the brutal reality of jungle warfare. This was a conflict fought not in minutes but in months. They faced an enemy determined to die rather than surrender. The first objective in this new phase was Guadalcanal. This was an obscure, pestilential island in the Solomons. The Japanese were constructing an airfield there that threatened the supply lines to Australia. The US invasion force, known as Operation Watchtower, landed Marines on August 7, 1942. They landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. They quickly secured the nearly completed airfield, soon renamed Henderson Field. But the Japanese response was swift and devastating. On the night of August 8 through the 9th, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a force of Japanese cruisers and tossed at a devastating naval ambush near Savo Island. In a matter of hours, Mikawa's force sank 4 American heavy cruisers. They crippled another, dealing the US Navy one of its most humiliating defeats. The result was catastrophic for the Marines ashore. The transports, fearing further attack, were immediately withdrawn. The Nissalas action left the ground forces isolated. They were stripped of heavy equipment and essential supplies. The waters around the island quickly earned their infamous name. They were called Iron Bottom Sound, the graveyard of countless warships. Guadalcanal became the central focus of a 6-month campaign. This campaign was defined by starvation, disease, and relentless combat. The island itself was a pestilential, monsoon-swept hellhole. The Marines battled the tenacious Japanese, but also pervasive mud and tropical downpours. They faced the debilitating threat of malaria. This threat was exacerbated by shortages of quinine. They also suffered the harsh side effects of the substitute drug atabrine. The defense of Henderson Field became the linchpin of the entire campaign. The airfield was built using vital mast and matting for expeditionary runways. Codenamed Sactus, the airfield was a constant magnet for Japanese counterattacks. The Japanese Navy was determined to retake the island. They initiated the Tokyo Express. This utilized high-speed destroyer runs under the cover of darkness to deliver troops and supplies. This led to a continuous, brutal series of night engagements. In these clashes, the Japanese proved superior in torpedo tactics. On October 16, 1942, a significant nighttime raid occurred. Japanese cruisers fired over 1,800 shells at the airfield. This attack destroyed dozens of aircraft. The airmen of the Unified Cactus Air Force operated from rudimentary bases in spare jungle conditions. They relied heavily on intelligence from Australian coast watchers. These watchers often provided over an hour's warning of incoming raids. The naval battles raged, consuming ships and men. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, exemplified the peril of these night clashes. Admiral Raizo Tanaka's destroyer torpedo attacks crippled 4 U.S. cruisers. This included the USS Minneapolis, which had its bow completely blown off. Only 1 Japanese destroyer was lost in the exchange. Just weeks earlier, the USS Juno was sunk. This sinking tragically took the lives of the 5 Sullivan brothers. Over the course of the campaign, Guadalcanal became a sinkhole for Japanese air and naval power. It drained their resources. Critically, it led to the attrition of over 15,000 Navy personnel and hundreds of veteran pilots. This was a loss from which they could not recover. As the grinding attrition continued, the Allies sought ways to strike at the heart of Japanese command. In April 1943, U.S. codebreakers achieved another monumental victory. They successfully intercepted and decoded the precise flight schedule of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was the architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet. This intelligence coup allowed Admiral Nimitz to authorize a daring assassination mission. On April 29, 1943, P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's flight over Bougainville. Their twin engines were ideal for long-range overwater operations. The coordinated air ambush brought down the Admiral's plane. This was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and naval command. It confirmed the superiority of American signals intelligence. The U.S. air advantage was further cemented by a stroke of luck earlier that year, the circuit in the northern Aleutian Islands. A Japanese Zero fighter crash-landed intact on Akutan Island, recovered by American forces. This aircraft allowed engineers to study its design flaws and strengths. This study contributed directly to the development of the superior F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat would soon sweep the skies of the Pacific. With Guadalcanal finally secured in February 1943, the Allies prepared for the next phase. This phase was known as Operation CART-WHEL. It was the formal implementation of the island-hopping strategy. This strategy sought to bypass heavily defended, non-essential strongholds. The primary objective was the massive Japanese fortress at Rabaul. The Allies decided not to invade Rabaul directly. They believed the potential casualties would be too high. Instead, they would neutralize it through isolation and relentless air attack. This strategy proved immediately effective. The Bismarck Sea Massacre in March 1943 demonstrated this effectiveness. Specially configured B-29 bombers executed devastating low-level and skip bombing attacks. These attacks targeted a Japanese convoy carrying the Imperial 51st Division. This crippled the reinforcement effort and forced the Japanese to abandon surface resupply. Rabaul was systematically isolated. It was starved of air and naval support. This turned the once formidable bastion into a strategically irrelevant prison for tens of thousands of bypassed Japanese troops. This event marked the beginning of the long, inevitable advance toward the Japanese home islands. That the year 1944 was defined by the relentless surge of the American dual advance. This was a pincer movement orchestrated by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz across the Central Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur pushed along the southern flank through New Guinea. The strategy was clear. They would leverage overwhelming industrial might and air superiority to seize islands. These islands would serve as lily pads for the next strike. They would establish forward bases for the B-29 Superfortress to begin the strategic bombing of Japan. But the path to the home islands was paved with coral, blood, and the fanatical resistance of an enemy fighting to the last man. The Central Pacific Drive was aimed at the heavily fortified Gilberts and Marianas. It began with a shocking demonstration of the brutality of amphibious warfare. The invasion of Tarawa in November 1943, though successful, was a charnel house. Nearly 3,500 Marines fell in 3 days. Of the 5,000-strong Japanese garrison, fewer than a dozen were captured in 2004. This bloody reality forced an agonizing re-evaluation of amphibious assault tactics and doctrine. Troops had waded through coral-bottomed waters under relentless machine gun fire. Their advance was slowed to a crawl. Tanks drowned, forcing crews to retreat under heavy fire. The visceral fear and grim determination of the troops were palpable. The initial romanticized notions of adventure were violently replaced by the stark necessity of survival. While Marines perfected the art of the assault, another, quieter campaign was strangling the Japanese Empire. The U.S. submarine fleet, now equipped with functioning torpedoes after early war failures, began to achieve devastating results. Led by Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, the undersea offensive decimated Japan's merchant shipping. Submarines sank over 3 million tons by early 1944. They would sink 5 million tons by the war's end. Submarines like the USS Barb, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, were commerce raiders. The legendary USS Wahoo, skippered by Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, was another. These large, relatively comfortable vessels were designed for long-range patrols. They effectively cut Japan's resource lifeline to Southeast Asia. They starved the home islands of oil, rubber, and food. This was a strategic pincer that mirrored Germany's failed U-boat campaign against Britain. The momentum continued into 1944. Following the seizure of Kwajalein and Eniwetok atolls, Admiral Nimitz prepared for the Marianas campaign. This operation would put B-29 bombers within striking distance of Tokyo. The invasion of these islands, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, was destined to provoke the decisive naval engagement. This was the battle Japan had long sought and desperately needed to win. The Japanese Imperial Navy, under Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, responded with Operation Eigo. This plan relied on the remaining core of their carrier fleet. It also depended on land-based air power. In Air Tower was augmented by over 200 carrier-qualified pilots flown into Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Ozawa's goal was attrition. He planned to whittle down the American carrier and amphibious task forces. He would then force a decisive surface engagement. The resulting clash, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, proved to be a catastrophic failure for Japan. U.S. air superiority was overwhelming. This was a consequence of superior aircraft like the Hellcat. It also resulted from the steady supply of trained pilots, maintained through effective aircrew rescue programs. Admiral Mark Mitcher's devastating pre-invasion air sweeps had already destroyed a significant portion of the Japanese land-based air force. When Ozawa's mobile fleet launched its attack, the Americans were ready. The sky became a shooting gallery. American pilots, flying their F-6F Hellcats, tore through the Japanese formations. These formations were often flown by inexperienced replacements. The engagement became known instantly as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over the course of the battle, American forces destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft. This effectively eliminated the Japanese naval air arm as an offensive force. Admiral Kakuta's fatal deception of Ozawa regarding the extent of these air battle losses compounded the tragedy. This deception led to a flawed offensive strategy. The Japanese carrier fleet itself was fatally wounded. It was hit not just by air attack, but by the relentless American submarine force. The carrier Taiho was sunk by the USS Albacore on June 18th. The Shikaku was sunk by the USS Kavala on June 19th. The loss of these carriers, alongside the annihilation of hundreds of inexperienced pilots, guaranteed American naval supremacy. Their anti-aircraft guns were also lost. Admiral Raymond Spruance's close defense of the Marianas, though sometimes criticized for caution, proved strategically sound. It allowed the complete annihilation of Ozawa's remaining carrier forces. The U.S. Navy's effective firefighting and damage control capabilities served as an unsung secret weapon. This ensured that American ships could absorb punishment that would have sunk their Japanese counterparts. With the Japanese fleet shattered, the invasion of the Marianas proceeded. Saipan was secured by July 9th and Guam by August 10th. The capture of these islands provided the crucial forward bases for the B-29s. This initiated the strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands. It directly threatened the empire. The ferocity of the fighting on Saipan was underscored by the horrific mass suicides off Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Japanese soldiers killed civilians with grenades. Mothers and children were shot when attempting to reach American lines. This was a grim testament to the fanaticism instilled in the defenders. Simultaneously, the strategic focus shifted south to the Philippines. This was driven by General Douglas MacArthur's famous vow to return. MacArthur's strategic vision was favored over Admiral Ernest King's preference for seizing Formosa. This plan was critical to severing Japan's resource lifeline to Southeast Asia. The Japanese, meanwhile, were operating on a foundation of dangerous self-deception. Admiral Halsey's carrier raids on the Ryukyus and Formosa occurred in October 1944. These raids were intended to soften defenses for the Leyte invasion. They led to grossly exaggerated Japanese claims of success. This premature activation of the Japanese SHO-2 plan was based on these false reports. It fatally depleted their remaining carrier airmen. This doomed their naval defense of the Philippines. The stage was set for the largest naval battle in history. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. On October 22nd, American submarines began the engagement. They ambushed Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force north of Singapore. They succeeded in sinking 3 heavy cruisers. The following day, Admiral William Halsey's powerful Task Force 38 located the center force in the Sibuyan Sea. This force was a formidable screen of 17 aircraft carriers and new battleships. Fierce air battles ensued. They resulted in the sinking of the super battleship Musashi. They also caused the loss of the light carrier USS Princeton. The Japanese plan was complex and desperate. Admiral Ozawa's decoy northern force consisted of the pitiful remains of Japan's carrier force. It successfully drew Admiral Halsey's attention north. This pulled the powerful Third Fleet away from the San Bernardino Strait. This proved to be a critical strategic miscalculation that left the invasion fleet vulnerable. Meanwhile, the Japanese Southern Force, commanded by Admiral Nishimura, attempted to penetrate the Surigao Strait. This occurred on the night of October 24th. There they sailed directly into a perfectly orchestrated trap. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded a layered defense. It consisted of PT boats, destroyers, and 6 modernized battleships. Among these was the USS West Virginia, refloated and refitted after her sinking at Pearl Harbor. The resulting Battle of Surigao Strait was the last major battleship gun duel in history. The American battleships crossed the Japanese T. They unleashed devastating salvos. The modernized USS West Virginia fired first. She was quickly followed by the others. Nishimura's force was systematically destroyed. Its ships were battered and sunk in a fiery, decisive end to the Japanese Southern Force. The critical danger, however, lay where Halsey had been decoyed. On October 25th, Kurita's center force penetrated the San Bernardino Strait unopposed. It found itself facing Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, and this force consisted only of small, vulnerable escort carriers and their gallant destroyer escorts. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they possessed to harass the approaching Japanese behemoths. Some were armed only with depth charges. The destroyers and destroyer escorts launched suicidal torpedo attacks. They laid smokescreens and daringly engaged Kurita's battleships. Kurita was baffled and bloodied by the ferocious resistance. Convinced he was facing Halsey's main fleet, he broke off the engagement. His nerves shattered. He reversed course, withdrawing from Leyte Gulf. This occurred despite being within sight of the vulnerable American transports. This was a profound strategic failure for Japan. Coupled with the decisive destruction of their fleet's ability to project power, it marked the end of the Imperial Navy as a cohesive fighting force. The Battle of Leyte Gulf and the subsequent Philippine campaign effectively severed Japan's sea lines of communication. This guaranteed that the home islands would be starved of the resources necessary to continue the war. The liberation of the Philippines was now inevitable. However, the fighting on the ground was only just beginning. This combat was driven by Japanese desperation and the introduction of terrifying new tactics, like the kamikaze attacks. The final push toward the Japanese home islands was characterized by escalating desperation and unimaginable cost. It was a testament to the Japanese resolve to fight to the death. Following the annihilation of their fleet at Leyte Gulf, Japan's defense doctrine fundamentally shifted. Their new focus was on attrition, designed to break American public will. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding on Iwo Jima, rejected the traditional Banzai charges. Instead, he prepared a labyrinthine subterranean defense. This defense aimed not at holding the beach. Rather, it was designed to inflict maximum casualties from deep tunnels and interlocking fields of fire. The battle became a test of endurance in a moonscape of loose volcanic ash. Marines advanced inch by bloody inch. The cost was staggering. This made the Iwo Jima campaign the bloodiest month in Marine Corps history. Yet the island's strategic worth was immediately affirmed. B-29 Superfortresses, damaged over Japan, began making emergency landings almost immediately. This saved thousands of airmen. The invasion of Okinawa, known as Operation Iceberg, was the largest seaborne invasion of the Pacific War. It involved over 500,000 men. The American 10th Army faced a determined enemy entrenched in the Shuri Line. This was a vast defensive perimeter built into coral mountain ridges and extensive underground tunnel networks. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the Japanese operations officer, had designed a defense that maximized carnage. The fighting was prolonged and desperate. American troops had to use flamethrowers and explosives to clear caves and bunkers. The constant, grinding combat, coupled with relentless suicide attacks, broke men psychologically. While ground troops suffered, the Navy endured the escalating horror of the divine wind. Kamikaze attacks strained American defenses to the breaking point. They inflicted heavy damage and succeeded in sinking dozens of warships. Yet, one of the war's most profound tragedies was unrelated to enemy airstrikes. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis sailed unescorted. She had just completed her ultra-secret mission delivering components of the first atomic bomb. 5 minutes past midnight, on July 30th, 1945, 2 Japanese torpedoes struck. The catastrophic damage severed all communications. This prevented any distress signal from being sent. Captain Charles B. McVay III was thrown from his bunk into acrid smoke. The ship listed severely and sank in just 12 minutes. Over 150 men plunged into the Philippine Sea. For 3 agonizing days, the survivors battled gut-wrenching thirst, the scorching sun, and exhaustion. They also faced the constant threat of shark attacks. The failure to report the ship overdue due to systemic communication breakdowns compounded the disaster. Only 317 men survived. This tragedy later led to Captain McVay's controversial court-martial. It highlighted the immense, often invisible human cost of naval operations. The high cost of Iwo Jima and Okinawa provided a grim forecast for the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. This was known as Operation Downfall. Estimates were staggering. A War Department document predicted 1.7 million to 4 million American casualties. It also projected up to 10 million Japanese deaths. Operation Olympic, targeting Kyushu, and Operation Coronet, targeting Honshu, would involve nearly 2 million Allied troops. Admiral William D. Leahy conveyed President Truman's intention to economize American lives. This sentiment was echoed by former President Herbert Hoover, who argued against the invasion. The sheer scale of anticipated loss was symbolized by the production of 1,532,000 Purple Hearts. This made the search for an alternative solution an urgent moral imperative. That alternative arrived in the form of unprecedented power. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay flew its mission. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. piloted the aircraft. He dropped the atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima. The airman described the sensory experience of the detonation. It was a lead taste, akin to an intense toothache. 3 days later, the Fat Man bomb incinerated Nagasaki. Simultaneously, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin fulfilled his long-standing promise. Before midnight on August 8, the Soviet Union declared war. Soviet forces immediately surged across the border. They quickly overwhelmed Japanese forces stationed in Manchukuo. This twin shock finally broke the stalemate in Tokyo. It was the annihilation wrought by the new weapon and the collapse of the northern strategic defense. Emperor Hirohito was desperately seeking an end to the war. He also wanted to preserve the throne. The emperor urged his people to endure the unendurable. Despite internal resistance from hardline generals, the emperor's will ultimately prevailed. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony took place. It occurred aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the event. He received the surrender from Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu. General Yoshijiro Umezu also surrendered on behalf of the Japanese military. The largest geographical conflict in human history was officially over. The war had irrevocably reshaped the global order forever. It established the United States as the dominant world power. It also ushered in the terrifying nuclear age. The war left behind a profound legacy of sacrifice and innovation. It delivered a stark, sober understanding of modern warfare's devastating potential. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.